Hi students, welcome for the second video. So in this video we will be discussing how an auditor is going to record the internal control systems. The last video we discussed what are the 5 components of internal control system. The same thing will be there for the another 2 concepts including this. So we will be having 3 important areas how we record the internal control system. First one is identifying the controls, secondly control objectives, thirdly documenting controls. With the right methods and tools, the auditor can achieve a better understanding of controls and help the management to determine which documentation method might be best serve as an organization need. So each and every thing will be recorded and that should be documented at the end. The first point says it identifying the controls. So before going for any process we have to identify. The auditor is going to identify what are the internal controls, what are the relevant objectives, where I have to identify the risk which is associated with the process, what are my activities, how to get the information, what are my communicative way, and how should I monitor all these aspects. So the controls can be identified at each and every level of the organization. Controls must reduce risk to an acceptable level, but that is not an excessive cost. So we use COSO components everywhere. What is COSO? That is Committee of Sponsoring Organization, or the 5 components of the internal control. That is control environment, risk assessment, control activities, information communication, monitoring. These are the 5 components of controls, and the auditor has to identify these controls before he go for the documentation. Once he identifies the controls, he has to go for the relevant objectives which is associated with the internal control system, because he has to record each and every level's internal control by having these components. Second one is control objective. So in addition to the 5 components or the COSO components, the auditor or the internal auditor has to identify the control objectives clearly. So if you want to understand the control objectives related to the activity or the process or the system which is prevailing in your organization, the internal auditor has to formulate the objectives of that particular internal control system. So they can go for copying or they can go for a download of all those objectives by various internet resources, or they can go to directly IAA's website. What is IAA? That is Institute of Internal Auditors. So Institute of Internal Auditors website ನಲ್ಲಿ ಕೂಡ ನಿಮಗೆ ಇಂಟರ್ನಲ್ ಕಂಟ್ರೋಲ್ನ ಯಾವ ರೀತಿ ನಿಮ್ಮ ಕಂಪನಿಲಿ ಇಟ್ಕೋಬೇಕು ಅನ್ನೋ ಒಂದು ಆಬ್ಜೆಕ್ಟಿವ್ಸು ಸಿಗುತ್ತೆ. ಸೊ ಕಂಪನಿಯವ್ರು ಏನು ಮಾಡ್ತಾರೆ, ಅದನ್ನು ಡೌನ್ಲೋಡ್ ಮಾಡಿಕೊಂಡು ಆ ಒಂದು SOPನ ಕಂಪನಿನಲ್ಲಿ ಅಳವಡಿಸ್ಕೊತಾರೆ. ಸೊ ದ ಕಂಟ್ರೋಲ್ ಆಬ್ಜೆಕ್ಟಿವ್ಸ್ ಮೇ ಬಿ in the document, and those documents should be one of the legal document of the organization. It may be a strategic plan, it may be a mission statement, it may be AAOA, it may be a business plan or a budget. So the internal auditor is going to use those materials when they are assessing the risk, and they were using the internal control, or they were measuring the internal controls effectiveness and efficiency. So how they are going to measure the risk which are identified by them? So there will be 4 bases. First thing is completeness. What prevents duplicate posting by the system? So whether it is completed with the books of accounts, whether they are maintaining the books of accounts in a complete manner. Secondly, accuracy. What ensures accurate data input? Data means the information which is supplied by the accountant, which the company is going to record in the books of accounts. So whether they are maintaining the accurate books of accounts or accurate documents in their company. Then validity. What prevents an unauthorized transaction? So what is validity? It should be related to a particular accounting or a financial year, and the restricted access. Who have the right to access those documents, because it is a confidential document. So these are the 4 components of the control objective. So the control objective should address a specific organization's risk which is related to completeness, accuracy, validity, and who have the access to the books of accounts, strategies, operations, and the internal control system of the organization. And the third one is documenting controls. Before starting the audit, the auditor should review the internal control system of the organization, because the auditor is more concerned about the examination or the evaluation of the internal control system, because it is one of the important part of the overall audit program. So the auditor needs the reasonable assurance with the accounting system, how the accounting system is there in the organization, how the segregation of the duties were happened, how arithmetical accuracy can be maintained in the organization, whether supervision of the or the monitoring of all the activities are done in the organization, because the internal control system assists in detection of the errors and frauds in the organization. So where the auditor is going to detect or prevent the error or a fraud, that is through books of accounts. So the auditor is going to check, or the internal auditor is going to verify the documents or the books of accounts. So all the transaction, whether it is correctly initiated, recorded, authorized, processed, and reported in the books of account, that is the first area where you will be getting the informations related to the books of account, as well as it is one of the identified control of the organization. When we are talking about documenting the controls, the next and foremost important thing is types of documentations. So how we are going to document all these recorded internal control system. So internal control documentation can take various designs or various forms. So I have mentioned flow charts, policy manuals, narrative descriptions, ICQs. So these are all the forms of documentation or the types of documentation, but the IAA, that is Institute of Internal Auditors, have not mentioned you have to go for any particular form of documentation. So you can use any one of the form of documentation for the explicit or the easy way of explanation of all those documents in a brief structure. So these structural internal control system can be explained or can be supplemented through these types of documents. So we'll talk about the first one, that is flow chart. A flow chart is a picture which shows all the separate steps of a process in a sequential order. So the auditor is going to use these flow charts to describe the flow of the activity through a process. So we have seen the organization structure, top level management, lower level, middle level, lower level, or the subordinate level. So a flow chart or the structured way of a graphical presentation will explain you before going for an analysis of those documentation. ನೀವು ಒಂದು ಪ್ರೋಸೆಸ್ನ ಅನಾಲೈಸಿಸ್ ಮಾಡಲೇಬೇಕಂತೇನಿಲ್ಲ. ಬೈ ಜಸ್ಟ್ ಸೀಯಿಂಗ್ ಇಟ್ ಯು ವಿಲ್ ಅಂಡರ್ಸ್ಟ್ಯಾಂಡ್, ಎಸ್ ದೀಸ್ ಆರ್ ದ ಆರ್ಗನೈಸೇಷನಲ್ ಸ್ಟ್ರಕ್ಚರ್ಸ್. ಸೊ ಬೈ ಅಂಡರ್ಸ್ಟ್ಯಾಂಡಿಂಗ್ ಅ ಗ್ರಾಫಿಕಲ್ representation of the data, you will be understanding the efficiencies and the deficiencies of the particular internal control system, and you can easily identify the risk associated to it, and you will be finding out what are the suitable measures to overcome the internal control problems. So this is first type of documentation, and the second type is narrative description. What is narrative description? This is opposite to flow chart. It is in form of a story, or it is in a detailed report. So a narrative describe or description process flows in a written form without any graphical representation. So they will be providing you all the data which is related to your existing practices, laws, regulations, rules, everything, but it is not in a flow chart, or it is not in a graphical representation. It is a theoretical or a narrative description. So it may serve or it may not serve as an effective tool, because sometimes you will not see or you will not read all the things which is given in your report, but when you are seeing a flow chart you will be understanding. For example, ಒಂದು ಬಾರ್ ಗ್ರಾಫ್ ಇದೆ ಅಂತಂದರೆ ನಿಮಗೆ ಪ್ರೊಡಕ್ಷನ್ಸ್ 1 ಇಯರ್ದು ಕೊಟ್ಟಿದ್ದಾರೆ ಅಂತಂದರೆ ಯು ಕ್ಯಾನ್ ಈಸಿಲಿ ಅಂಡರ್ಸ್ಟ್ಯಾಂಡ್, ಯಾವ ಇಯರ್ನಲ್ಲಿ ಜಾಸ್ತಿ ಇದೆ, ಯಾವ ಇಯರ್ನಲ್ಲಿ ಕಮ್ಮಿ ಇದೆ. ಬಟ್ ಅದನ್ನೇ ನಿಮಗೆ ಒಂದು 30 pages ಒಂದು ನೆರೇಟಿವ್ ರಿಪೋರ್ಟ್ನಲ್ಲಿ ಕೊಟ್ಟಿತ್ತು ಅಂತಂದರೆ ಹೇಗೆ? ಬಟ್ ಇಫ್ ಇಟ್ ಈಸ್ ಸ್ಮಾಲ್, ಯು ಕ್ಯಾನ್ ಗೋ ಫಾರ್ ದ ನೆರೇಟಿವ್ ಡಿಸ್ಕ್ರಿಪ್ಷನ್ ಟು. ಸೊ ಯು ಕ್ಯಾನ್ ಗೋ ಫಾರ್ ಎನಿ type of documentations as it is mentioned by the IAA. Then the third one is internal control questionnaire or ICQ. What is ICQ? It is just a questionnaire which is given to the stakeholders of the organization to measure, to identify and to evaluate the internal control which is implemented in the organization. So if your ICQ should be effective, then it should be structured carefully, then logically you have to ask the questions to the stakeholders. It may be employee, shareholder, customer or the general public. So it helps the management and the internal auditors document process to find the strength and the weakness of the system. So where should I have to work and what is the good thing by the internal control which is already prevailing in the organization. Then the auditor is going to check the ICQs, because ICQs are the permanent record. So you will be recording, you will be collecting all these ICQ from the respective stakeholders and you will be maintaining a separate file. So it will be useful for the further evaluation process of the internal control too. ಸೊ ICQs ಅಂತಂದರೆ ಒಂದು ಕ್ವೆಶನೇರ್, ಆ ಕ್ವೆಶನೇರ್ನಿಂದ ನಿಮಗೆ ಬೇರೆಯವರಿಂದ ಇನ್ಪುಟ್ ಸಿಗ್ತಾ ಹೋಗುತ್ತೆ. ಸೊ ಬೇಸ್ಡ್ ಆನ್ ದೋಸ್ ಇನ್ಪುಟ್ಸ್ ಯು ವಿಲ್ ಬಿ ಕಮಿಂಗ್ ವಿತ್ ದ report whether it is effective or ineffective. Then next one is risk and control matrices. What is risk and control matrix? It is a powerful tool. So out of all these documentation types, it is a powerful tool which can help an organization to identify, giving a rank or implementation of controlled measure. So it will be used to mitigate the risk. Risk and control matrices are used or which is linked to objectives of the control and it is related to risk. So these are useful for the evaluation of the design and effectiveness of the control system. So ಕಂಪನಿನಲ್ಲಿ ಪ್ರಿವೇಲ್ ಆಗಿರುವಂಥ ಕಂಟ್ರೋಲ್ ಸಿಸ್ಟಮ್ನ ಫೈಂಡ್ ಔಟ್ ಮಾಡೋದಕ್ಕೆ, ಐಡೆಂಟಿಫೈ ಮಾಡೋದಕ್ಕೆ ಆ್ಯಂಡ್ ಅದರ ರಿಸ್ಕ್ನ ಕಡಿಮೆ ಮಾಡೋದಕ್ಕೆ risk and control matrices is very useful. So these are related to risk and control objectives of the internal control of the organization. And fifth one is policy and procedure manuals. What is policy and procedure manuals? It is just a document or it is a written or a text form document which consists of each and every aspects of the company's policy, procedures, documented all those things, internal aspects of the company, everything is written or recorded in this policy and procedure manuals, and this is going to establish a systematic framework and sound guidelines for all the processes and activities of the organization. So by having these policies and procedure manuals, the organization can easily communicate their policies, decisions on managing specific processes. So from top level management to lower level management, they can easily communicate. So that will helps in achievement of the organization goals by increasing the performance of the organization. Okay, what is sound documentation? So now you have understood what are the sound documentations or the types of documentations. So there are many techniques like flowchart, narrative description, internal control questionnaires, risk and control matrices, policy and procedure manuals. So any one of these technique or type of documentation can be used as the best practices in your organization to identify and to document the internal control system. So specific method anta enilla, any method, but it should give you a fair and true picture of your company's internal management. So it will be useful for the evaluation and also financial reporting of the organization. Thank you.